He read the novel all the way to its final page. He knew exactly how this world was meant to end. In blood, in ruin, and in his own lonely, forgotten death. There was just one small problem. He had just woken up inside of it, trapped in the body of the story's most useless villain. This is the story of how one ordinary man decided to tear up his own tragic ending and rewrite his fate, from the very first line. It begins with a student. A dreamer. A quiet, unremarkable young man named Suho Kim, who spent his long days studying civil engineering in the crowded lecture halls and muddy construction sites of modern Korea. He was nobody special, and he knew it. He woke up tired, worked until his hands ached, and scraped by from one thin paycheck to the next. He never once imagined that his small, gray, ordinary life was about to be torn away and rewritten from the very beginning. Because in the world where this story truly unfolds, he would not be Suho Kim at all. There, he would answer to a completely different name. Lloyd Frontera. And this is the tale of how a single, average engineering student took an entire fantasy world and turned it, brick by brick and blueprint by blueprint, completely upside down. But to understand the man who stands triumphant on that green hill, arms thrown wide as he laughs at a golden future only he can see, we first have to go back. Back to the very beginning, before the fortune, before the fame, before he became a name whispered across an entire kingdom. Back to the night it all began, when he was nothing more than a frightened man in a stranger's body, lying alone in the dark with no idea what was coming. It started, of all things, with a wish. Out of nowhere, without any warning, a glowing message appeared in the air before him. He had been chosen, entirely at random, to have a single wish granted by a mysterious force that called itself only the Absolute. Congratulations, it chimed brightly, as though fate itself were leaning down to applaud him. And then, before he could even make sense of the words, the whole world dissolved into light around him. There had been no time to choose, no careful list of options. Later, he would wonder endlessly what exactly he had wished for, in the half a heartbeat before everything changed. Had it been a wish to escape his tired, gray life? A wish for something more, something bigger than the endless grind he had always known? The Absolute never bothered to explain itself, and it never would. It simply reached down, plucked him out of his old world like a single chess piece lifted off a board, and dropped him somewhere new without so much as a warning. Whatever he had asked for, the universe had clearly decided to answer it in the strangest and most dangerous way it possibly could. When he finally opened his eyes again, a new message was already waiting. He was now, it calmly informed him, a character living inside a web novel called Night of Blood and Iron. The very same novel he had finished reading only the night before, alone in his cramped little room. He barely had a moment to understand it. He had not asked for this. He had not even had a single drink to blame it on. And yet here he was, reborn into another world entirely, waking up face down in the cold dirt of a lonely country road, a grand and distant manor watching silently over him from across the darkened fields. He was freezing. Every muscle in his unfamiliar body ached. And something, he quickly realized, was horribly wrong with his jaw. It had slipped clean out of place while he lay unconscious on the frozen ground, a small and cruel indignity that the world seemed almost gleeful to point out to him. One sharp, painful snap forced it back into place, and as the throbbing faded, so did the fog in his mind. Whose body, exactly, had he woken up inside of? There was only one character in the entire story who lived all the way out here in the middle of nowhere, and who was reckless enough to pass out drunk on the side of a public road. Master Lloyd. The name settled over him like a cold, heavy stone dropping into his stomach. Of all the brave knights and clever nobles and powerful mages that filled those pages, fate had handed him the single most useless one of them all. A minor side character. A joke. A cautionary tale meant only to make the real heroes look better. For a brief, bitter moment he almost laughed at the cruelty of it. But deep down he already understood one important thing. A useless character still had one advantage. Nobody, absolutely nobody, would ever see him coming. Then, cutting through the darkness, came a voice. Footsteps drawing closer. The cold glint of a blade catching the moonlight. And that silver light spilled across the features of a young man with pale, silver hair, who looked calmly down and told him it was time to return to the manor. Suho recognized him instantly. He looked exactly, impossibly, perfectly as the book had described him. This was Javier Azrahan, the true protagonist of the entire novel. And if Javier himself stood here, addressing him by name, then there could be no more denying it. Suho Kim was gone. He was now Lloyd Frontera, the story's doomed, drunken, good-for-nothing hooligan. Back at the manor, seated by the warm glow of the fireside, Javier explained how the disastrous night had unfolded. Lloyd had begun drinking in the afternoon, gotten sloppily drunk, smashed apart the furniture of the village pub in a blind rage, and finally collapsed unconscious along the road home. It was, apparently, a perfectly ordinary day in the life of Lloyd Frontera. The Baron, his father, had sent Javier out into the freezing night to find him and carry him home, because a fool, however hopeless, was still his son. Suho studied the young knight carefully out of the corner of his eye, matching the calm, handsome face before him to every line he could remember from the book. Everything fit. The proud posture, the quiet loyalty, the cold and careful way he chose each word. It was a dizzying thing, to sit across from a character he had only ever known as ink on a page, and to realize that this person now breathed, and thought, and could bleed, exactly like any real man. If Javier was this real, then every danger written into the story was just as real too, and every single one of them was now racing steadily toward him. Shivering on the cold stone floor, Suho ached for the simple warmth of the heated floors he had left behind, a comfort this rough medieval world had never dreamed of. And just before the knight turned to leave, Suho stopped him with a single, strange, quiet question. Was the family, he asked, deep in debt? It was a bizarre thing for the reckless Lloyd to ask, and the knight left without a real answer. But Suho did not need one. He already knew everything. The night before, in that cramped boarding house room, he had read this very novel all the way to its final, bitter page. And so he knew, with perfect and terrible clarity, exactly how the story of Lloyd Frontera was meant to end. The Baron and Baroness, ruined by a cunning con artist, would lose every acre of their land and every coin of their fortune before dying together in despair. And Lloyd himself would sink into the gutter, a hopeless, drunken beggar, crying out for one more drink, until at last he coughed up blood and died, alone and forgotten in the dirt. What, he thought bitterly, was even the point of being born noble, if this was the ending waiting at the end of the road? He had failed to find happiness in his first life, no matter how hard he had worked for it, and now his second life seemed determined to end in blood and ruin. 2 lifetimes, both of them heading straight for the same cliff. But there was one crucial difference this time, one thing that changed absolutely everything. This time, he already knew where the cliff was. He had read the whole tragedy from beginning to end, and a man who knows exactly where the danger lies has every chance in the world to steer around it. Knowledge, he realized, was the one weapon that no baron, no con artist, and no cruel twist of fate could ever take away from him. He could not accept it. He would not. And so, the very next morning, beneath a bright and almost mocking sun, he set out to change his fate with his own 2 hands. His mother, the gentle Marbella, quietly asked him to go down to the village and apologize for the wreckage at the pub. It was not truly his mess, but it was this body's mess, and so he decided he would be the one to clean it up. His parents could only watch in speechless bewilderment as this strange, calm, unfamiliar version of their son agreed so readily. Down in the village, the reaction was far worse. The moment the people caught sight of him, they scrambled to hide, ducking behind carts, diving behind stacked barrels, one mother even yanking her curious child back from an open window. "Whatever you do," they whispered, "do not make eye contact with that man." The truth was impossible to ignore. This entire village absolutely despised him. And the silent night trailing behind him was no escort at all. Javier, he realized, was there specifically to protect the frightened villagers from Lloyd himself. It would have crushed most men. But if a reputation had been built by actions, then it could be torn down by actions too, one honest deed at a time. He would not waste his breath trying to argue with their fear or beg for a second chance he had not yet earned. He would simply be patient. He would be smarter than the man whose face he now wore, and far more disciplined than anyone in this village could possibly expect. Let them stare. Let them whisper and hide behind their doors. He would change their minds not with pretty words, but with results they could see and touch and feel with their own two hands. So Suho set himself his first goals. First, scrub away this rotten, scumbag reputation that clung to him like old smoke. Second, clear away the family's crushing mountain of debt, long before the disaster written in the book ever had a chance to strike. And then, perhaps, live out a long and comfortable life as the peaceful heir to a country barony. Half in desperation, half in dark humor, he checked whether his new self came with any convenient cheat skill. He found two. Human scum, and rowdy drunkard. Truly, what wonderful gifts. No secret martial art, no hidden bloodline. Just his own mind, and everything it had ever learned. But he was not the kind of man who sat around waiting for the world to hand him a lucky break, and he never had been. If the game refused to give him a proper cheat, then he would simply build one himself, out of the one thing this world could never copy or steal. Every calculation, every diagram, every hard-won lesson from his old life was a tool now, and he intended to use all of them. At the pub, he bowed his head low and took the full blame for everything. But his sudden, unexpected politeness only terrified the poor pub owner more. The man practically begged him to stop, somehow far more frightened by a courteous Lloyd than a violent one. To him, kindness from a known monster could only be some new kind of trick. It was a small, painful lesson. A ruined reputation is not repaired with a single bow. Trust, once shattered, has to be rebuilt slowly, brick by careful brick, exactly like one of his own buildings. And even out in the street, Javier calmly pointed out the deeper truth. Everything Lloyd had smashed had been bought with the pub owner's hard-earned money, and no apology would matter until every coin of it was paid back. But compensation, on top of all their debt, felt hopelessly impossible. Unless the debt itself could be erased, nothing here would ever change. But how? That was the question that gnawed at him. And then Javier mentioned something almost in passing, one offhand remark that would change everything. The pub owner's elderly mother had fallen gravely ill in the biting cold of the late winter. The pub was freezing. A single small fireplace could never warm the entire drafty building, and a frail old woman could not endure that kind of cold for very long. Unless, of course, there were heated floors. And there it was. The spark. Suho stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes went wide. And somewhere deep in his mind, a single brilliant light bulb flickered, sputtered, and blazed fully to life. Ondul. The traditional Korean underfloor heating he had studied for years and built with his own two hands. The principle was beautifully simple. Instead of one weak fire struggling to heat the air, you carved hidden channels beneath the floor and guided the heat of a single fire through them, warming the very stone from below, so the whole room stayed warm long after the fire had died. This world had never once seen anything like it. If he could build it here, it would sell. It would absolutely, spectacularly sell. The old Lloyd, the drunken hooligan, could never in 1,000 years have dreamed this up. But Suho Kim, the real him, the engineering student, the former military engineer, the veteran of countless muddy construction sites, absolutely could. He had spent years learning how to read the land, how to turn raw earth and timber and stone into something solid and lasting. All of that knowledge, so ordinary and unremarkable back home, was close to pure magic in a world like this one. Where the people here saw only dirt and rock and endless cold, he saw foundations, drainage, insulation, and warmth. He saw problems that could be solved and comforts that could be sold. And a need this widespread, met by a man with no competition whatsoever, was not a simple favor. It was a business, waiting to be built. For the first time since he had woken up in this strange body, Soho Kim felt the ground grow firm beneath his feet, because at last he was standing on something he truly understood. This was it. This was the key. The one single idea that could wipe away every last debt the family carried. He turned to Javier, a fierce new fire burning in his eyes. Back to the pub, he declared, for it was time at last to land his very first order. And in that exact moment, the world itself seemed to answer him. A glowing notification bloomed in the air. His true journey, it announced, had finally begun. A relationship point system flickered to life, a strange and powerful mechanic where every bond he built and every ounce of trust he earned would carry real, tangible power. His current total? 0. He was, in every sense, starting from absolutely nothing. But 0, he knew better than anyone, was not the same thing as hopeless. 0 was simply a starting line, and every great structure ever raised had once been nothing more than empty ground and a single careful plan. Earn people's trust, and grow stronger. Help them, and be rewarded. It was, in its own strange way, the most honest deal he had ever been offered. So he would play it, patiently and cleverly, exactly the way he had learned to do everything else in life. One brick, one bond, and one small honest victory at a time. Most men in his position would have felt only fear, or despair, or the hopeless urge to simply give up and drink themselves into the very grave the story had already dug for them. But Soho Kim, who had long ago learned how to keep working even when his whole body screamed at him to stop, felt something else entirely rising in his chest. He felt ready. For the first time in this whole doomed story, the hopeless hooligan Lloyd Frontera held something no one ever expected him to possess. A plan. And this was only the very beginning. He had a plan to save a doomed and dying family. But a plan means absolutely nothing if not a single soul believes in the man behind it. And in this cold little village, no one trusted the drunken hooligan Lloyd Frontera. Not the farmers, not the shopkeepers, not even the loyal knight who followed him everywhere. So he did the only thing he could. He picked up a shovel, and he set out to prove every last one of them wrong. The system had spoken. Relationship points, it told him, earned by winning the trust of the people around him. But it offered no manual, no instructions, no helpful list of tips. Only a single cold number floating in the air. And that number, when it came to Javier, was miserably, painfully low. Worse still, every clumsy attempt to buy the knight's favor with a little flattery only seemed to drag it lower. Trust, he was quickly learning, could not be bought with pretty words. It would have to be earned the hard way, through sweat, and proof, and results. He thought about it for a long while, turning the strange system over in his mind like a puzzle. In his old life, he had never been good at charming people or talking his way into their hearts. He had only ever known how to work, how to build, how to solve a real problem with his own two hands. And perhaps, he realized, that was exactly the point. These points would not reward a smooth talker or a clever liar. They would reward a man who actually helped people, who actually changed their lives for the better. If that was the game, then it was a game he could win. Not with words, but with warmth, and shelter, and honest labor that anyone could see and feel for themselves. His plan, at least in theory, was beautifully simple. He would rebuild the pub owner's cold and damaged building from the ground up, and he would install Ondal, the heated floors of his old world, writing off the entire cost of the construction as repayment for the furniture he had smashed. It solved two problems at once. It repaid a debt, and it built something no one in this land had ever seen. But the pub owner, weary and worn down by a lifetime of Lloyd's cruelty, agreed only reluctantly, absolutely certain that this had to be some new and elaborate kind of trick. And who could blame him for thinking so? For years, the only thing Lloyd Frontera had ever brought to this village was trouble. Broken furniture, frightened customers, unpaid tabs, and drunken threats. The pub owner had learned, through hard experience, that when a Frontera smiled at you, it was wise to check your pockets afterward. So when this same young master suddenly appeared, calm and polite and offering to rebuild his shop for free, the poor man did not feel gratitude. He felt fear. He kept waiting for the cruel twist, for the moment the mask would slip and the real Lloyd would come roaring back. It never came. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled him the most. So Lloyd picked up his shovel and began to dig. And in a body this weak, this soft, this ruined by years of drinking, every single scoop of dirt was pure agony. His arms trembled. His back screamed. His hands blistered and bled. But he did not stop. He dug out the foundation, he raised a traditional timber frame beam by beam, he packed the walls with clay dug straight from the river, and he split wood until he could barely lift his arms above his head. Work that should have taken a team of skilled builders a full week, he threw himself into with a desperate, relentless energy. His body begged him to stop after every hour, but his mind refused to listen. He had spent his old life on construction sites just like this one, learning to push through the exhaustion, to keep his hands moving long after his muscles had given up. That discipline, buried deep inside him, did not care what body he was wearing now. It drove him forward through the pain, through the cold, through the endless ache in his shoulders. Every beam he raised and every wall he packed was one small step further from the tragic ending written in that book, and that thought alone was enough to keep him going. If suffering now meant survival later, then he would gladly suffer, and he would not complain even once. Javier watched all of this in open, silent confusion. It made no sense to him. Where could a lazy, drunken hooligan possibly have learned to build like this? Where did this endurance come from, this knowledge, this refusal to quit? The young master he thought he knew would have given up before the first hour was out. But this man just kept going, hour after hour, day after day. And slowly, almost against his own will, the knight found himself picking up a tool and lending a hand. It was a strange thing, to feel respect growing for a man he had been sent to babysit. Javier had watched Lloyd fail and disappoint everyone for years, had carried his drunken body home more times than he could count. He had expected nothing from him, and he had never once been surprised. But this was something new. A man did not fake this kind of exhaustion. A man did not blister his own hands for a stranger's sake as part of some clever con. Whatever had happened to Lloyd Frontera on that cold road, whatever had changed him so completely, Javier could no longer simply dismiss it. And so he worked beside him, quietly, and he began, for the very first time, to wonder. And then, at last, it was finished. A small, humble, honest little house, with a warm fire at its heart and gentle heat flowing quietly beneath its floor. It was not much to look at. But it was warm. And in a place where winter could kill the old and the weak, warmth was worth more than gold. Lloyd had built the first Ondal house this world had ever seen, with his own two blistered hands. The true test came when the pub owner's frail, sickly mother lay down on that warm floor for the very first time. She had spent the entire brutal winter shivering, her old bones aching with a cold that never seemed to leave her. But now, as the gentle heat rose up through the stone and wrapped around her like a blanket, something remarkable happened. The pain melted away. The tension left her body. And for the first time in longer than her son could remember, the old woman smiled. A real, warm, peaceful smile. It was such a small thing, and yet it was everything. All the engineering, all the calculations, all the aching hours of labor had come down to this single quiet moment. An old woman, warm at last, resting easy in a house that would keep her alive through the winter. For Suho, standing there in the doorway, it was a feeling he had almost forgotten. The deep, honest satisfaction of building something that truly mattered to someone. Back in his old world, his work had often felt invisible, just another anonymous project among thousands. But here, he could see the result of his labor written plainly on a grateful old woman's face. And he understood, in that instant, that this was worth far more than any number the system could ever give him. Her son could hardly believe his eyes. He thanked the young master again, and again, and again, his voice cracking with an emotion he could not hold back. This was the same Lloyd Frontera he had feared and hated for years. The same man who had smashed his furniture and terrorized his customers. And now that very same man had given his dying mother the first comfort she had known in months. It did not make any sense to him. And yet, there it was, plain and undeniable, warm beneath his feet. And the world began to take notice. Javier's approval of him quietly climbed. The points ticked steadily upward, one by one. It was impossible, people whispered to one another in the street. The real Lloyd Frontera would never, ever have done such a thing. He must be sick. He must be scheming. There simply had to be some hidden angle, some trick they could not yet see. That was how deeply the old Lloyd had poisoned his own name. People were more willing to believe he had gone mad than to believe he had genuinely changed for the better. And in a strange way, Suho understood their doubt completely. Trust, once broken so many times, does not come rushing back at the first kind gesture. It returns slowly, cautiously, testing each step like a man crossing thin ice. He would simply have to keep proving himself, over and over, until the weight of the evidence became impossible to deny. And yet, somehow, against all reason, he had truly done it. Word of the miracle spread quickly from house to house, and soon curious villagers were lining up outside, marveling at the strange and wonderful warmth, quietly begging to have a room just like it in their own cold homes. And that, right there, was the moment the true idea crystallized in Suho's mind. This was not just a way to repay one debt or win over one family. This was demand. Real, hungry, widespread demand, from an entire village full of people who suffered through the same killing cold every single winter. Every one of them wanted what he had built. Every one of them would pay for it. He was not merely apologizing anymore. He was standing at the very beginning of a business, one built on a need that no one else in this world even knew how to meet. The debt that had once seemed impossible now looked, for the first time, like something he could actually pay. It was working. The plan was actually working. But Suho was not foolish enough to believe that trust could be rebuilt in a single day, or with a single good deed. The villagers still eyed him with deep suspicion, still half expected the cruel old Lloyd to return at any moment. And the family's enormous debt still loomed over everything like a gathering storm, as large and as heavy as they had ever been. One warm house was a beginning. It was not yet a victory. There was so much more work still to be done, and so little time in which to do it. Still, he allowed himself a small, tired, honest moment of pride. He had taken the single most hated man in the village and, brick by brick and beam by beam, had begun to change the way the world saw him. He had proven, if only to himself, that his knowledge was real, that his plan could work, that the doomed ending written in that book was not carved in stone after all. The road ahead was still long and dark and full of danger. But he had taken his first real step down it, and he had not stumbled. He thought of the story he had read, of the ruin and the death that waited at its end, and for the first time he truly believed he could change it. Not with magic. Not with a hero's sword. But with the quiet, stubborn, unglamorous power of knowing how to build. The Baron and Baroness were still destined to lose everything to a con artist. The debt still had to be paid. The villagers still had to be won over, one by one. It was an enormous mountain to climb, and he was starting at the very bottom of it. But mountains, he knew, were climbed exactly the same way that houses were built. One careful, deliberate step at a time. And then, just as he bent over his sketches, planning his next move, a familiar voice called out his name. Stern. Heavy. Unmistakable. It was a voice that carried the weight of authority and the disappointment of years. Lloyd looked up slowly, already knowing exactly who he would find standing there. His father. The Baron, Arcos Frontera, had come at last to see with his own two eyes exactly what his troublesome, good-for-nothing son was really up to. This was the man who held the family's fate in his hands, the man whose land and title and future were all quietly slipping away. If Suho was going to save this family from the ruin written in the book, he would first have to convince the one person who had every reason in the world to doubt him. His own father. A father who had watched his son fail again, and again, and again, until hope itself had worn thin. Lloyd straightened his aching back, wiped the dirt from his hands, and met the older man's hard, searching gaze without flinching. Whatever happened next, he knew, would decide everything. And this, like everything else, was only the beginning of the story. Two cruel men were coming to take everything his family owned. They had the law, the money, and years of experience on their side. All Lloyd had was a book he once read, and the secret hidden inside its pages. But sometimes, knowing exactly how a story ends is the only weapon a man truly needs. This is the day the doomed hooligan turned the trap around, and taught two seasoned sharks a lesson they would never forget. It began with his father. The Baron, Arcos Frontera, stood before him with a hard and searching look, demanding answers. Where had this strange new focus come from? What exactly was his troublesome son scheming this time? Lloyd did not flinch, and he did not lie. He explained it all, plainly and calmly. He had built the pub owner a heated ondal room, and already the orders were beginning to pour in from across the land. These were the people the family was sworn to protect, he said, and he would never lie to them or cheat them. His father studied him for a long, silent moment, unconvinced and yet unable to look away, because this was simply not the boy he thought he knew. The Lloyd he remembered would have mumbled excuses, or lashed out, or slunk away to find another bottle. This one met his eyes without fear and spoke with a quiet, steady confidence that Arcos had never once seen in his son. It unsettled the old Baron more than he wanted to admit. Part of him wanted to believe it. Part of him had been disappointed too many times to dare. So he simply watched, and waited, and let his son show him with actions what words could never prove. Because in the end, a man's true character is revealed not by what he says, but by what he does when everything is on the line. And while that quiet storm brewed, Lloyd finally learned how to truly use the strange system that had been handed to him. The relationship points he had earned were not just a score to admire. They were currency, and he could spend them. With a thought, the system offered to trade those points for skills, each one drawn directly from everything Suho Kim had already learned in his old life. Surveying. Structural design. Water supply and sewage theory. Concrete and steel. Even the logic of programming. The entire toolkit of a modern engineer, sitting there waiting to be unlocked, one point at a time. It was almost too perfect. In his old world, these were skills he had spent years and countless sleepless nights struggling to master, buried in thick textbooks and endless calculations. Here, they could be his in an instant, as long as he kept earning the trust of the people around him. The system had, in effect, turned his greatest strength into a currency. The more good he did, the more powerful he became, and the more powerful he became, the more good he could do. It was a loop, a rising spiral, and Suho intended to ride it all the way to the top. Every point was a brick. And he was going to build an empire out of them. It was a staggering realization. With enough points, he could survey a stretch of land with nothing but his own two eyes, reading the slope and the soil the way other men read a book. He could draft plans of a precision and cleverness that no builder in this world could ever hope to match. Every skill he unlocked made him more capable, more valuable, more impossible to ignore. And then he noticed something stranger still, tucked away in a corner of the system. A summon. A way, it seemed, to call something loyal and powerful to his side. He filed that away for later. First, there was a more pressing problem to deal with. Because trouble had already arrived at the door. Two moneylenders came striding into the manor to collect on the Baron's crushing debts. They were smug, and they were cruel, the kind of men who had grown rich by feeding on other people's desperation. They looked around the fading estate with hungry eyes, hinting that they might strip it bare, piece by piece, to settle the balance. And then one of them dared to suggest something truly vile. That perhaps the Baroness herself, and her ladies, could be sold off to cover what was owed. His father's face went white with helpless rage. There was nothing he could do. The law, it seemed, was on the lender's side. This was exactly how it had happened in the book. This was the beginning of the end, the first thread that, once pulled, would unravel the entire family. In the story he remembered, the Baron had been too proud and too honorable to fight men like these, and that honor had cost him everything. His land, his title, his wife, and finally his life. The con artists had smiled their oily smiles and picked the family clean, and no one had ever stopped them. But that was the story as it was written. And Suho had absolutely no intention of letting it play out that way ever again. The pen, this time, was in his hand. But Lloyd had read this story all the way to its bitter end. And he remembered these men. He remembered exactly the kind of scheme they ran, and exactly how they used the law like a weapon against families too proud and too ignorant to fight back. More importantly, he remembered the loophole. There was an old, obscure clause buried deep in the kingdom's laws, the very same clause that, in the novel, had once saved Javier himself inside a courtroom. Most nobles had never even heard of it. But Suho Kim never forgot a single detail he read, and this detail was about to change everything. So he set his trap, and he set it with a smile. He goaded the lenders, needled them, provoked them until their arrogance got the better of them and they overstepped, threatening things the law did not actually allow. And that was the moment he sprang it. Calmly, almost casually, he recited the Royal Family and Nobility Act, the exact article that made their conduct a crime against the crown itself. The room went silent. The lenders' smug grins froze and then cracked, because they knew, instantly, that he was right. In a single stroke, the trap they had laid for his family had snapped shut around their own throats. Cornered and exposed, their threats collapsed into nothing. All their bluster, all their cruelty, all their careful intimidation, undone by a few quiet lines from a law they had counted on no one knowing. Lloyd paid them only what was truly, fairly owed, drawn from the steady stream of orders his Ondal business was already bringing in. And then he sent them away, furious and humiliated, beaten cleanly at their own game. As they stormed out, they swore under their breath that this was not over, that a mere baron's son would regret humiliating them. Suho only watched them go, unbothered. He knew men like this never truly gave up, that they would slink back into the shadows and plot their revenge. But that was a problem for another day. Today, they had come to devour his family whole, and instead they were leaving with nothing but their wounded pride. Today, the story had bent to his will instead of the other way around. And every time he forced it to bend, he grew a little more certain that its tragic ending could be broken for good. His father watched the entire thing unfold in stunned, speechless silence, hardly able to believe that his good-for-nothing son had just dismantled two hardened sharks with nothing but words and knowledge. The reward came at once. A soft chime rang in Lloyd's ears. His father's approval of him had climbed by 6 full points, and a fresh wave of relationship points came flooding in behind it. It was proof, clear and undeniable, of the truth he had bet everything on. Knowing this story, remembering every twist and every hidden detail, was a weapon sharper than any blade a knight could carry. Where others saw only a hopeless situation, he saw the exact page where the answer was written. And it was more than just a clever trick. In that single confrontation, something had shifted between father and son. Arcos had spent years watching Lloyd fail and disappoint him, until he had quietly given up hope of ever seeing the boy become a man. But now, for the first time, he had watched his son stand tall in the face of real danger and protect the family with nothing but his own wits. That kind of thing could not be faked. And slowly, cautiously, the Baron began to wonder if the impossible might actually be true. If his hopeless son had somehow, against all odds, truly changed. For Suho, it was another quiet victory, another small step away from the ruin written in the book. He was learning, with each passing day, exactly how powerful his knowledge really was in this world. He knew which men were dangerous and which were merely loud. He knew which laws could save a family and which could destroy one. He knew where the story was heading, and that meant he could always be 3 steps ahead of everyone around him. It was, he thought, the greatest cheat any man could ask for. While his enemies plotted in the dark, he already knew their moves. While others panicked at each new disaster, he calmly turned the page and read what came next. He was not stronger than the villains of this world, not yet. He was not richer, or more powerful, or better connected. But he could see the future, and in a game like this one, foresight was worth more than any army. Every trap laid for him was a trap he had seen coming a mile away. Every secret his enemies guarded, he already held in the palm of his hand. But he also understood that knowledge alone was not enough. A book could tell him where the danger was, but it could not dig a foundation, or pour a wall, or fight off an enemy in his place. To truly change his family's fate, he would need more than memory. He would need hands, and tools, and power of his own. He would need to build not just houses, but a force strong enough to protect everything he was working so hard to save. The con artists would return. Enemies far more dangerous than 2 greedy lenders waited further down the road, written into chapters he had not yet reached. A clever mind could win a single battle, but surviving the whole war would take much, much more. He would need money, and allies, and strength that could stand on its own 2 feet. He would need people loyal to him, tools that no one else possessed, and advantages his enemies could never even dream of. Piece by piece, he was assembling exactly that. And the next piece was waiting for him inside the system. And that was exactly why his mind kept drifting back to that strange little option he had noticed in the system. The summon. He did not yet know what it would give him. A servant, perhaps. A soldier. A monster. The system was maddeningly vague about it. But he had points to spare now, more than he had ever had, and a growing certainty that whatever waited on the other side of that summon could become a key piece of everything he was planning to build. He imagined the possibilities as he turned the idea over in his mind. Perhaps a skilled craftsman to speed his construction. Perhaps a fierce guardian to stand between his family and the dangers ahead. Perhaps something he could not even picture yet, something this world had never seen. The system had a strange sense of humor, he was learning, and it rarely gave him exactly what he expected. But it had never once given him something useless. Every gift it offered, however odd it first appeared, had a purpose hidden inside it, waiting for a clever enough mind to find it. So, with the lenders gone, his father quietly reconsidering everything, and his Ondal business finally taking root, Lloyd allowed himself a small, tired smile. The trap had been turned. The family had survived another day. And now, at long last, it was time to reach into that mysterious system and claim his very first summon. Whatever came out of it, he was ready. And this, like everything else in his strange new life, was still only the beginning of the story. He had earned the right to summon something powerful to his side. A mighty beast, perhaps, or a loyal warrior. So under the cover of night, far from any watching eyes, he opened the system and paid the price. Light exploded. Gears turned. Power roared. And out of the glowing circle dropped the single most ridiculous creature he had ever seen. A hamster. This is the day Lloyd Frontera summoned a tiny rodent, and turned it into the most valuable construction machine in the entire world. Let us go back to that quiet, moonlit night. Lloyd stood alone in an empty field, making absolutely certain that no one was around to see him. What he was about to do could not be explained to anyone in this world. He opened the strange summon game hidden inside his system, took a deep breath, and spent his hard-earned points. And the world answered with a spectacle worthy of a legend. A brilliant magic circle bloomed beneath his feet. Gears of light spun and ground against one another. Energy crackled and roared into the sky, building and building toward some grand, earth-shaking arrival. And then, with a final flash, it was over. The light faded. The roaring stopped. And there, sitting in the middle of that fading magic circle, blinking up at him, was a tiny, round, fluffy hamster. It was small. It was noisy. It was, by any measure, utterly and completely unimpressive. For a long moment, Lloyd simply stared at it in flat, tired disbelief. All that build-up, all that spectacle, all those precious points, for this. He very nearly wrote the whole thing off as a complete and total waste. He had imagined a fearsome dragon, or a towering golem, or at the very least a capable human servant. Instead, the grand and mysterious system had handed him something he might have found hiding in a farmer's grain sack. It would have been almost insulting, if it were not so absurd. But Suho had learned, through hard experience, never to judge one of the system's gifts too quickly. Time and again, the things that first seemed useless had turned out to hide the greatest value of all. So instead of tossing the little creature aside, he did what he always did. He stopped, and he thought, and he asked himself one simple question. What is this thing actually good for? But this was no ordinary rodent. Its name, the system informed him, was Padong, and its little instruction manual promised something genuinely remarkable. Fed a single red sunflower seed, the creature would swell up to a gigantic size for a full 12 hours. Fed a blue one, it would shrink right back down to its tiny, harmless form. And hamsters, as everyone knows, are born to do one thing better than almost any creature alive. They dig. They tunnel. They burrow through the earth with relentless, tireless energy. And that was the exact moment the true genius of it all clicked into place in Suho's engineering mind. A hamster the size of a house, tearing through solid earth with its bare paws, was not a pet. It was a machine. It was the heavy excavation equipment that this backward medieval world could never hope to build. No steam engines, no hydraulics, no diesel motors. Just one enormous, cheerful, impossibly strong hamster, ready to dig a foundation in the time it would take a team of men to lift their shovels. This was the way Suho's mind worked, and always had. Where others saw only what a thing was, he saw what it could become. A useless summon became priceless equipment. A patch of frozen ground became the foundation of a warm home. A hopeless situation became an opportunity, if only you looked at it from the right angle. It was not magic that made him dangerous in this world. It was the simple, stubborn habit of refusing to accept that anything was truly worthless. Everything had a use. You just had to be clever enough, and patient enough, to find it. He put the theory to the test at once. He fed Padong a red seed, and watched in amazement as the tiny creature ballooned into a towering giant. Then he set it loose on the earth. What followed was almost beyond belief. In a mere 30 minutes, the giant hamster dug out a pit that would have taken a full crew of laborers an entire day of backbreaking work. And with every scoop, every burrow, every joyful tunnel, the creature grew better at its craft, leveling up its digging and its dirt packing right before his astonished eyes. Lloyd could hardly stop himself from laughing out loud. This ridiculous little ball of fur, the summon he had almost thrown away in disgust, was worth more to him than 100 hired workers. It never tired. It never complained. It never demanded wages or rest. It simply dug, tirelessly and joyfully, exactly where he pointed. In his old world, an excavator like this would have cost a fortune and burned through fuel by the barrel. Here, it ran on nothing but sunflower seeds and affection. The other nobles of this land had their armies and their gold and their ancient bloodlines. Lloyd had a giant hamster. And in his hands, that hamster was about to reshape the entire barony. With his engineering skills unlocked and a monster-sized excavator now at his command, Lloyd turned his attention to the next great bottleneck. Labor. Building an empire of heated homes would take more than one man and one hamster, no matter how gifted they both were. So he went to his father and borrowed 30 of the barony's idle soldiers, men who spent their days standing around guarding a family that could barely afford to feed them. He would put them to honest, useful work at last. But before a single shovel touched the ground, he drilled one rule into their heads above all others. Safety first. It was a phrase they had never heard before, a strange idea from a strange new master. In this world, laborers were simply expected to work until they dropped, and if a few of them were injured or killed, well, that was just the cost of building things. But Suho refused to accept that. He had come from a world where a single careless mistake on a construction site could cost a man his life, and he had learned to respect that danger deeply. His workers would be protected. His workers would go home whole. And bewildered but obedient, the soldiers followed his lead. At first, they thought the young master had lost his mind. Why waste time on all these strange precautions? Why care whether a common laborer lived or died? But as the days passed, something unexpected happened. The men began to trust him. For the first time in their lives, someone in charge actually cared whether they came home to their families at the end of the day. They worked harder, not out of fear, but out of loyalty. And Suho understood a truth that the proud knights of this world never had. That men who are respected will always outwork men who are merely commanded. He was not just building houses. He was building a team, and a reputation, one careful, deliberate decision at a time. For a while, everything was going better than he could have hoped. The hamster dug. The soldiers built. Beyond all business grew. But not everyone in the barony welcomed these strange new changes. And soon, a proud and angry figure came striding onto the worksite to confront him. His name was Newman, a senior knight of the Frontera household, a man who had served the family for many long years. He was deeply, personally offended by what he saw. Proud soldiers, warriors of the barony, down in the dirt like common diggers. To him, it was a disgrace, an insult to their honor and to his. But Lloyd knew this man. He remembered him with perfect clarity from the pages of the book. And what he remembered was ugly. Newman was no loyal servant. Newman was the traitor. In the story, it was this very knight who quietly sold the Baron's secrets to the con artists, who fed them every weakness they needed to destroy the family, and who then abandoned the Fronteras the very moment the ship began to sink. Behind that proud, honorable face was a man simply waiting for his chance to betray everyone around him. It was a chilling thing, to look into the eyes of a smiling servant and know, with absolute certainty, that he would one day help murder your entire family. To everyone else in the barony, Newman was a respected veteran, a pillar of loyalty who had served faithfully for years. Only Suho knew the rot hidden beneath. And that knowledge put him in a strange and lonely position. He could not simply accuse the man, for he had no proof that anyone would believe, only the memory of a book no one else had read. But he could watch him. He could stay one step ahead of him. And when the time came, he could make sure that this traitor never got the chance to write his betrayal into reality. So Lloyd did not bow to his wounded pride. He did not soothe him or apologize. Instead, he needled him, provoked him, and exposed the ugliness hidden beneath that noble mask, refusing to grant him even a single ounce of the respect he so clearly believed he was owed. He knew exactly what kind of man stood before him, and he had no intention of pretending otherwise. If Newman wanted to play the part of the honorable knight, then Lloyd would happily hold up a mirror and show everyone what was really underneath. Furious, humiliated, and utterly unaccustomed to being spoken to this way by a man he considered a worthless hooligan, the old knight drew his wounded pride like a blade and demanded satisfaction. A duel. A formal contest of honor, one that he was absolutely certain a soft, drunken noble like Lloyd could never hope to win. In his mind, this was the perfect way to put the insolent young master back in his place, and perhaps to remind the whole barony exactly who the real power was. But Lloyd only smiled. A slow, knowing, dangerous little smile. He raised his hands and tapped his fingers lightly in the air, almost as though he were pressing the buttons on an invisible game controller. If it was a fight the traitor wanted, then it was a fight he would most certainly get. Most men in his position would have been terrified. A duel against a trained knight, in a frail and out-of-shape body, sounded like a quick and painful way to die. But Lloyd was already thinking, already planning, already turning the problem over in that restless engineer's mind of his. Every challenge was just another puzzle to be solved, and he had spent his whole life solving puzzles that others called impossible. He did not yet know exactly how he would win. But he knew that he would. And more than that, he knew that beating this smug, treacherous knight in front of the entire barony would send a message louder than any words. That the hooligan Lloyd Frontera was gone, and something far more dangerous had taken his place. Newman had no idea what he had just walked into. He saw a weak, useless noble. He did not see the mind of a modern engineer, or the memory of a man who knew this story's every secret, or the quiet confidence of someone who had already begun to bend fate itself to his will. And this, like every challenge before it, was only the beginning of the story. In 1 month, he would have to duel a trained knight to the death. There was just one problem. He could barely lift a sword. He was a soft, out-of-shape noble in a body ruined by years of drinking, facing a seasoned warrior who had killed men before. By every measure, he should lose. But Lloyd Frontera had never once played fair, and he had absolutely no intention of starting now. This is the story of how an engineer prepared to beat a swordsman without ever learning to fight. The terms had been set. In exactly 1 month's time, Lloyd would face Sir Newman in a formal duel. And the cold truth was impossible to ignore. Newman was a real swordsman, disciplined and dangerous, while Lloyd was a nobody trapped in a frail and clumsy body. If he stepped onto that field unprepared, he would be cut down in seconds. And he understood, better than anyone, that this duel was about far more than his own pride or even his own life. If he lost, everything he had built would collapse with him. The on-doll business, the growing trust of the villagers, the fragile new respect of his father. All of it would crumble the moment the hooligan was cut down by a real knight, and the family would slide right back toward the ruin written in the book. Losing was not an option. It had never been an option. He needed to get stronger, and he needed to do it fast. He needed a teacher. And in the entire barony, there was only one man worth learning from. Javier. But when he asked, the knight flatly refused. He had no interest in wasting his time training a hopeless drunk for a duel he was certain to lose. And so Lloyd reached, once again, for the one weapon no one could ever take from him. The story. He knew a secret about Javier, a secret buried in the pages of the book. The great swordsman, for all his skill, suffered from a crippling, sleepless curse. Insomnia. Night after night, he lay awake, unable to rest, an affliction the book blamed on his very mastery of the blade. And Lloyd, of all people, knew exactly how to cure it. Not with medicine. Not with magic. But with something far more powerful. His own excruciatingly dull textbook on reinforced concrete, a book so mind-numbingly boring that it could put any living man to sleep within minutes. It was, he promised, more effective than any lullaby ever written. Cornered by an offer he could not refuse, and desperate for a single night of real rest, Javier finally agreed. A deal was struck. The knight would teach him to fight, and in return, Lloyd would give him the gift of sleep. It was, when Soho thought about it, a perfect little trade. Two men, each holding exactly what the other needed most, brought together by a book that only one of them had ever read. Javier believed he was doing the young master a reluctant favor. In truth, Lloyd had engineered the entire arrangement from the very start, playing on a weakness his opponent did not even know was public knowledge. This was how he fought. Not with muscle, but with information. Not by being the strongest man in the room, but by always knowing something no one else did. And so the training began. It was brutal. 50 laps around the perimeter of the estate, over and over, a weak and trembling body pushed far past its breaking point. Javier fully expected him to quit. He waited for the whining, the excuses, the moment the spoiled young master would throw down and declare it all too hard. It was, he was certain, only a matter of time. But that moment never came. Because Lloyd did not stop. What Javier could not understand was that this was not really Lloyd running those endless laps. It was Suho Kim. And Suho remembered another life entirely. He remembered a cramped little room in a boarding house, remembered the endless nights working delivery jobs that never ended, remembered hauling heavy boxes up flight after flight of stairs while his whole body screamed for rest. He remembered the exhaustion, the despair, and the thin, stubborn hope that if he just kept going, someday things would get better. Compared to that grinding, hopeless struggle, a few laps around a field were nothing at all. So he ran. And he ran. And he refused, absolutely refused, to fall. Every time his legs threatened to give out, he reminded himself of everything that was riding on this. His mother's smile. His father's fragile new hope. The old woman warm on her heated floor. The whole future he was trying to build, one aching step at a time. Pain was temporary, he told himself, but the ruin waiting in that book was forever, unless he was strong enough to stop it. So he pushed through the burning in his lungs and the trembling in his legs, lap after lap, day after day. He was not training to survive a duel. He was training to change a destiny. And a man fighting for something that truly matters will always outlast a man fighting for nothing. And slowly, watching him, something began to shift inside the cold and disciplined night. This was not the behavior of a lazy noble. This was the quiet, relentless determination of a man who had suffered, and survived, and refused to break. Day by day, Javier's respect for him grew, and with it, his approval climbed higher. The points ticked steadily upward. Even the rest of the household began to whisper that something in the young master had truly, deeply changed. But not everyone was watching with hope in their hearts. Newman, the treacherous knight, was sharpening plans far darker than a simple contest of honor. He had no intention of letting this insolent hooligan embarrass him in front of the barony. In his mind, the duel was the perfect opportunity. He would cut the young master down, make it look like a tragic accident, and use the chaos that followed to climb higher than ever before. To him, Lloyd was already a dead man walking. He simply did not know it yet. What Newman failed to understand was that he was the one walking blind. He saw only a foolish noble playing at being a fighter, a soft target ripe for the killing. He had no idea that his opponent already knew his true nature, already knew his hidden treachery, and had likely already guessed at the murderous plan forming behind his eyes. The traitor thought he was the hunter. In reality, he was the prey, circling closer and closer to a trap he could not even see. And Lloyd, patient as ever, was more than happy to let him believe he held all the cards, right up until the very moment he didn't. The days passed. The training continued. The body that had once trembled after a single lap grew stronger, steadier, more capable with each passing week. And then, at last, the month was gone, and the day of the duel arrived. A crowd gathered around the field, murmuring, curious, certain they were about to watch the foolish young master get exactly what he deserved. Newman stepped forward, blade in hand, calm and confident, and asked if the young master was finally ready to meet his end. And Lloyd only smiled. He planted his boot on the handle of a shovel, flipped it up into his waiting hand, and gripped it like a weapon. Not a sword. A shovel. The crowd could hardly believe their eyes. But Lloyd was not afraid, and he was not joking. He had a plan, as he always did, one that Newman could never have seen coming. He looked the traitor dead in the eye, that same dangerous little smile playing across his face. Oh, he was ready. He was ready to knock the treacherous knight's lights clean out. And this, of course, was only the beginning of the story. A trained knight with a razor-sharp sword. Against a drunken noble holding a farmer's shovel. The entire crowd was certain they knew exactly how this would end. They were about to be proven very, very wrong. This is the duel that shattered everything the barony thought it knew about the hooligan Lloyd Frontera. The whole field fell silent as the young master strode out to meet his opponent, carrying nothing but a plain iron shovel. A shovel, against the blade of a seasoned knight. It had to be a joke, a final act of foolishness from a man who had clearly lost his mind. People shook their heads. Some almost pitied him. But it was no joke at all. Because when Sir Newman finally struck, Lloyd moved in a way that no one on that field had ever seen before. He did not fight like a noble. He did not fight like a knight. He moved with a speed and a brutal, ruthless efficiency that seemed to come from another world entirely. He blocked, he jabbed, he countered, every motion precise and economical, wasting nothing. It was the cold, practical science of modern bayonet combat, a style of real fighting refined centuries beyond anything this medieval world had ever imagined. The wide iron head of the shovel became both a crushing weapon and a solid shield, and with every clash, the veteran knight grew more rattled, more confused, more afraid. It was as if swordsmanship itself had leapt forward through the ages, and left him standing in the past. Newman had trained his whole life in the elegant, formal art of the sword, the kind of fencing passed down through noble houses and knightly orders. But what he faced now was something entirely different. It was combat stripped of all its beauty and ceremony, distilled down to one brutal question. How do you end a fight as quickly and efficiently as possible? Every move Lloyd made had a purpose. There were no wasted flourishes, no proud stances, no honor to defend. Just cold, practical violence, engineered for results. And against that, all of Newman's years of refined training were almost useless. He was a master of a game his opponent simply refused to play. His month of punishing training had paid off in full, and the system rewarded him for it, granting him a brand new skill all his own, born from the sweat and pain of those endless days. Every lap he had run, every ache he had pushed through, every moment he had refused to quit, had all been quietly building toward this. The shovel in his hands was no longer just a farming tool. In his grip, it had become an extension of his own body, a weapon he understood down to its very balance and weight. This was the reward for his relentless discipline, the proof that his suffering had not been wasted. While Newman had grown complacent in his fame, resting on years of old glory, Lloyd had spent that same month bleeding and straining and forging himself into something new. The crowd watched in stunned, disbelieving silence. This was not the drunken hooligan they had come to mock. This was something else entirely, something dangerous, something none of them could explain. And Newman, the proud and treacherous knight, was slowly beginning to panic. Humiliated and growing desperate, the traitor reached at last for his trump card. Mana heart. The mana conjuring art that, in the pages of the book, had once made even Javier himself the strongest man in the entire world. Raw power came flooding into the old knight's blade, crackling and roaring, gathering into a single devastating strike. For a moment, it seemed hopeless. No untrained man, no matter how clever, could possibly withstand a blow carrying that much raw mana. The crowd held its breath. Surely, now, the young master would fall. This was the moment Newman had been waiting for. The moment he would remind everyone why knights were feared and hooligans were nothing. In the story Lloyd remembered, this very power had been nearly unstoppable, a force that could level walls and shatter armor. And Newman poured every ounce of his hatred and his wounded pride into that single strike, determined to end the insolent young master once and for all, and to make it look like nothing more than a tragic accident of the duel. But Lloyd had not come to this fight with only one weapon. He had come prepared for exactly this. He had studied, he had planned, he had thought through every possibility, just as he always did. And so, when that mana-charged strike came crashing down, he did the one thing no one expected. He met it head-on. He absorbed the crushing blow, took the knight's overwhelming power, and turned it back against him. To an engineer, even magic was just another force to be understood, measured, and redirected. Where Newman saw an unstoppable weapon, Lloyd saw energy that had to go somewhere, and a clever man could always decide exactly where. He did not try to overpower the strike. He guided it, the way a well-built channel guides a flood, letting the knight's own strength carry him off balance and expose him completely. And in that single, perfect opening, Lloyd struck. With one devastating swing of that humble iron shovel, he brought the whole fight crashing to its end. The blow landed with impossible force. Newman was hurled backward, staggering, a tooth flying loose from his mouth, his proud body slammed hard into the dirt. The crowd could not believe what they were seeing. The great sword expert, the seasoned knight, the pride of the barony, had lost. Utterly, completely, undeniably lost. Beaten by a so-called hooligan wielding nothing more than a common farm tool. For a long moment, no one made a sound. And then the judge, hardly able to believe his own voice, declared Lloyd Frontera the winner of the duel. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd, then a rising murmur, then something close to awe. They had come to watch a fool die, and instead they had witnessed the impossible. The same young master they had spent years mocking and fearing had just faced a mana-wielding knight and won, with a farmer's tool in his hands. In a single afternoon, the entire story the barony had told itself about Lloyd Frontera had been torn to pieces. No one knew quite what to make of him now. But no one, from that day forward, would ever dare to underestimate him again. But Lloyd was not finished. Not even close. Because he alone knew what kind of man Newman truly was. He had read exactly what men like this did to families like his own. The quiet betrayal. The whispered secrets sold to the enemy. The ruin, the suffering, and the deaths that always followed. This was the traitor who would one day help destroy everything Lloyd was fighting so hard to protect. And so, even as the crowd shouted that the duel was over, that he had won, that it was finished, Lloyd raised his shovel once more. It was time, he had decided, for this traitor to take a proper pounding. And down came the shovel. Again. And again. And again. To some in the crowd, it might have looked like cruelty. But Soho knew better. He knew exactly the kind of ruin this man would bring if left unchecked, the families he would help destroy, the lives he would help end. Mercy toward a viper like Newman was not kindness. It was simply a wound waiting to happen. And so Lloyd made absolutely certain, in front of the entire barony, that this particular snake would never again find the confidence to raise its head. Some lessons could only be taught the hard way, and Newman was learning his in full. The crowd cried out. Newman howled and begged. But Lloyd was sending a message, loud and clear, to everyone watching. That he was no longer the soft, foolish young master they could push around. That anyone who threatened his family would answer for it. And that the days when men like Newman could plot against the Fronteras in safety were finally, permanently over. For years, the vultures had circled this family, sensing weakness, waiting to feast. The lenders, the con artists, the traitors within their own walls. They had all believed the Fronteras were easy prey, a dying house with a useless heir. But that was no longer true. There was a new master now, one who fought without mercy and thought several moves ahead, one who would not hesitate to make an example of anyone foolish enough to test him. The message Lloyd carved into the dirt that day was simple. This family was no longer defenseless. And anyone who came for them had better be prepared to lose. When it was done, the barony would never look at Lloyd Frontera the same way again. The hooligan was gone, truly gone, and in his place stood a man who had beaten a knight with a shovel, absorbed a master's mana, and refused to back down from anyone. It was a victory that would echo through the whole land. And for Suho, it meant far more than winning a single fight. It meant he had removed a knife that would one day have been aimed at his family's back. It meant the traitor's plans, so carefully laid in the pages of the book, had been shattered before they could ever begin. Step by step, choice by choice, he was rewriting the doomed story he had read, replacing its tragic ending with something new, something of his own making. The road ahead was still long, and far more dangerous foes than Newman waited in the chapters to come. But he had proven, beyond any doubt, that fate itself could be beaten. And it was, of course, still only the beginning of the story. He had beaten the traitor in a duel. But beating a man and dealing with him are two very different things. Now Lloyd held proof of a betrayal that had not even happened yet, a kind father who wanted to show mercy, and a snake who would strike again the moment his back was turned. This is the story of how the greatest estate developer closed out his first great trial, with wisdom, with foresight, and with one very large hamster. In the calm after the duel, Lloyd kept his end of the bargain. He helped Javier perfect the mana technique the knight had struggled with for years, the difficult art known as the Azrahan core method, guiding him at last to conjure more power than he had ever managed before. It was the very technique that, in the story, would one day make Javier the strongest man in the world. And Lloyd was helping to unlock it early, quietly turning the novel's greatest hero into a loyal ally. With every lesson, Javier's respect for him deepened, and his approval climbed higher still. It was a masterstroke, though almost no one realized it at the time. In the original story, Javier had been a distant figure, a hero who walked his own lonely path and owed the Fronteras nothing. But Lloyd was quietly changing all of that. By helping the knight unlock his true potential years ahead of schedule, he was binding the strongest man in the world to his own family, one act of genuine kindness at a time. Where others might have feared such a powerful figure, Lloyd saw an ally worth more than any army. And he was earning that alliance not through tricks or threats, but by helping Javier become everything he was meant to be. But there was still the matter of the traitor to settle. And Lloyd had come prepared with proof. The night before, he had sent his faithful little hamster, Padong, scurrying through the walls of the estate to retrieve a set of hidden letters. They were the secret correspondence between Newman and the very con artists who, in the book, would one day destroy the family. The letters laid the entire scheme bare. The plans to forge documents, to steal the barony's land, to pick the Fronteras clean and leave them for dead. It was all there, written in the traitor's own hand. And this was the genius of that ridiculous little summon he had almost thrown away. A giant hamster could dig a foundation in minutes, yes, but a tiny one could slip unseen through the smallest cracks in the wall and fetch whatever its master needed. Newman had hidden those letters carefully, certain that no one would ever find them. He had never imagined that his downfall would come in the form of a small, fluffy rodent squeezing through a gap in the stone. Once again, Lloyd had taken something everyone else dismissed as useless and turned it into the perfect tool for the job. It was exactly how his mind worked, and exactly why his enemies never saw him coming. Lloyd laid the evidence before his father. Anyone else, seeing such a betrayal, would have demanded the traitor's head on the spot. But the Baron, Lloyd Frontera, was a genuinely kind man, and kindness urged him toward mercy. Perhaps Newman could be given a chance to repent. Perhaps there was still good in him. It was a noble instinct, and Lloyd understood it completely. But he also knew, from the pages of the story, exactly where such mercy led. And so he gently pressed a much harder truth upon his father. A kind leader and a good leader, he explained, are not the same thing. Forgive a rotten apple, and it does not become sweet again. It simply spreads its rot to everything around it, growing more cunning and more dangerous with every second chance it is given. A good leader had to protect his people, even when it meant setting his own kindness aside. Newman would not repay mercy with loyalty. He would repay it with a knife in the dark, exactly as he had in the story Lloyd remembered so well. This was the burden of knowing the future. Lloyd could see, with perfect clarity, the ruin that mercy would bring, even when everyone around him saw only a chance for kindness. His father looked at Newman and saw a loyal servant who had perhaps lost his way. Lloyd looked at him and saw the exact page on which this man would help murder the entire family. It was a lonely kind of knowledge, and a heavy one. But it was also his greatest strength. He could not afford to be naive, not when he alone understood how close his family truly stood to the edge of the cliff. Still, Lloyd offered a path forward, one that would let his father keep his honor while still keeping the family safe. They would give Newman one final test, dressed up as a genuine chance at redemption. The terms sounded almost absurd. If the proud knight could be brought down by nothing more than a simple mouse, then he would be exiled from the land for good. It seemed like a joke, an insult even, and Newman sneered at the very idea. A mouse? Bring down a knight of his skill and standing? The whole notion was ridiculous. But Lloyd was not talking about an ordinary mouse. With a small, knowing smile, he fed his hamster a single red sunflower seed. And in an instant, the tiny, harmless little creature swelled up into a towering, unstoppable giant. Newman barely had time to understand what he was looking at. One flash, one thunderous slam, and the proud, treacherous knight was crushed to the ground and utterly beaten, brought low exactly as promised, by nothing more than a mouse. The test had been passed. The terms had been met. And there was no arguing with the outcome. The whole affair had been a lesson wrapped inside a spectacle. To the watching crowd, it looked like a strange and almost comical punishment. But every choice Lloyd had made carried a deeper purpose. His father kept his honor, having offered the traitor a fair chance. The family was rid of a deadly enemy without spilling a drop of noble blood. And everyone in the barony received a quiet, unforgettable warning about what happened to those who plotted against the Fronteras. It was justice, mercy, and a public message, all delivered in a single, unforgettable stroke. That was the difference between simply being strong, and being truly wise. The rotten apple was finally gone. Newman was exiled from the barony in complete disgrace, stripped of his position and cast out from the only life he had ever known. As he was dragged away, he screamed his hatred and swore his revenge upon the Baron and his lowlife son, promising that this was not the end. But his threats were empty now. His teeth had been pulled, his plans had been shattered, and the knife he had meant to bury in the family's back had been taken from his hand before he could ever use it. And so, the young master won again. Not with a sword, not with an army, not with brute strength, but with knowledge, with foresight, and with one enormous, cheerful hamster. He had taken a betrayal that was destined to destroy his family and unraveled it completely, long before it could ever begin. He had turned the story's greatest hero into his ally, cleared a traitor from his home, and proven to everyone around him that the doomed Frontera family was doomed no longer. And when he stopped to think about how far he had come, even he could hardly believe it. Only a short time ago, he had woken up face down in the dirt, a stranger in a dying man's body, with nothing but the memory of a book and a mountain of debt. Now he had a thriving business, a loyal knight, a father who was beginning to believe in him, and a giant hamster at his command. Piece by piece, exactly as he had promised himself on that first cold night, he was building a future out of nothing at all. The estate had survived its very first true trial. The debts were beginning to shrink. The villagers were beginning to trust. The father was beginning to believe. And the hopeless hooligan, who had been written into a story only to die drunk and forgotten in the dirt, had instead begun to build something extraordinary. Brick by brick, bond by bond, victory by victory, Soho Kim was rewriting his fate, and the fate of everyone around him. The tragic ending in that book was slipping further away with every passing day. And the true journey of the greatest estate developer had, at long last, only just begun.